Okay. Hi everyone, it's Tiffany Bao again, and today I'm very happy to be here to present our work, How Shall We Play the Game? A game theoretical model for cyber warfare games. So first of all, let me just introduce our authors a little bit. So this paper happened in year 2017. It's like 2 years ago when I was still a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon, and we have another two student authors which who they have their PhD from UC Santa Barbara. And later on, we three graduated, and now we are all at university, I should say, Arizona State University as assistant professor. So you see, this is one of few papers that all authors are professors. Okay, anyway, so I'd like to start my presentation with a story because I was told that, starting presentation with a story is a good strategy. So, Cyber Grant Challenge, as you guys may already know, this is a competition held by DARPA in year 2016. And in this competition, the first place is going to win $2 million. The second place win $1 million, and the third place got $750,000. So very interestingly, after the game, after the final, we found that in order to win the third place, all you need to do is just do nothing, not to attack, not to patch, and just stay there during the game, and you will get the third place. So strategy does matter. If you knew how the other player play, and also if you knew that the other player's skill set over there, this will help you decide what is your best move. And actually, you don't need to pay too much attention on techniques in this specific game because of the actions of the other players and also the techniques of the other players had during the game. Not only just for DARPA, not only just for the CGC. In real world, we do make decisions. For example, NSA discloses 91% of the zero-day vulnerabilities that it discovers in software made or used in the United States to developers. So we disclosed, well, not me, but I mean, NSA discloses 91% of the vulnerabilities. That means that they, probably stockpile or just keep temporarily for the other 9% due to some strategic reason. And also, when we talk about 91% of disclosure, it doesn't mean that they just not use it at all. It's possible that they decide to use that for specific purpose and later on actually disclose it. So in real world, we do make decisions on the discovery of vulnerabilities. And also we, as users, also make decisions on zero-day vulnerabilities or new patches in terms of new vulnerability. And let's just ask ourselves how many times that we click the Remind Me Later button when we come across a security update. And also, if now there's happening to be update in my laptop right now, when I am giving this presentation, it's very likely that I will click Remind Me Later button because I don't want you guys to wait for me, and that's a cost. So we do make our decision based on our imagination or our estimation of the cost and the benefit comes from a security patch. So as I mentioned, we are making decisions, and we are making decisions based on our considerations, and so does the government. So according to vulnerability equity policy and process for the United States government, before they make any decision, they need to consider a lot of elements, such as how likely that an adversary will attack me using the vulnerability, and if an adversary attacks me, how much will I lose from the attack? But those decisions are made by human. That means that sometimes human can be error-prone, and also human can be ineffective or inefficient. So the goal for us when we are doing this research is to come up with a way to augment the human decision-making process. Especially, we are trying to augment that with techniques rooted in game theory. And this is just a normal process. It is a general process that we do when we think about people's decision, or when we try to use techniques from a game theory to tackle the decision-making problem. So we want to come up with a model, and we want to come up with an algorithm based on this model, and using this algorithm, hopefully we can compute the decision. However, there is a challenge over there, which is the balance between model and algorithm. So the more comprehensive the model it is, actually, the less possible that this algorithm is efficient, because based on the complexity of the model to compute the decision, sometimes the algorithm will be inscalable or it's just too costly. So there's a trade-off between model comprehensiveness and algorithm efficiency. Okay, so previous work, what does those fantastic researchers do for this topic? Previous work focuses on finding analytical results for optimal decisions, and they have put strong assumptions which oversimplify the real-world scenarios. For example, the CyberHawk model assumes that a player only chooses one action, either to attack or to disclose. However, we already know that it's possible that an agent or a software company, well, actually, let me just say an agent, because an agent could decide to attack first and then disclose later. So that can be a sequence of actions over there. Also, the SHREP model assumes that when a player makes an action, the player is certain about whether the other player have known the vulnerability, which is not always the case. Because once someone finds a 0 day, he doesn't know whether or not the other people has known this 0 day. If the other people are stockpiling this 0 day vulnerability, it's just that I thought that is 0 day, but maybe it is actually not. So we want to build a model to overcome those limitations of the previous models. And we want to consider, as I mentioned, multiple actions over time, and also the uncertainty of the other people, whether or not they have discovered 0 day vulnerability. And based on the model, we want to propose a feasible algorithm for approximating the decisions that we want to make over there. Okay, so now let's talk about how to make decisions, how to augment humans' decisions using techniques in game theory. So we first want to build this model, and particularly, we build this model as a partial observation stochastic game. And based on that, we want to compute the Nash equilibrium, and by the end of this introduction, I will talk about special case study, which is CGC. Okay. So let's start with decision making. Suppose I am a player. I have multiple computing resources. I have some laptops. I have some cell phones and sub-tablets. And now I find a bug. I have a security bug that I need to address. I will have a strategy, but when I make my decision, when I come up with my strategy, I need to consider questions such as, what benefit does my threat actor gain by exploiting this vulnerability? And when I am thinking about this question, I am considering an adversary, which also has some computer resources, but may be different from the resources that I have. And this adversary will also come up with a strategy. So the decision is actually made based on a multi-agent game. This is why we want a game over there. And we want to have a multi-agent single run game first to abstract my decision process that I just introduced to you. So let's say we have a player, and the player has vulnerable resources. And if the player has not discovered a vulnerability, the player cannot do anything but no op. Let's say no op is an action. On the other hand, if the player discovered a vulnerability, the player can choose either to withhold this vulnerability or to attack or to patch. And similarly, we have our adversary who will also be able to make similar decisions. Okay, now let's start to extend this model. Let's start to think about how to encode the multiple actions over time. So now suppose at the beginning, let's just assume that this is a single round game where two players, they're making their one action. But it's possible that, over the time, and the players continue to make their action, and actually their actions are made in different time. And the way that we encode that is to consider this game as a repeated game where each player make their actions for each round. And in this specific case, there are some of the slot, which is some of the round that the player actually doesn't do or doesn't intentionally to choose any action, and we just pad that with the withhold action, because that means that when a player decides to, let's say, attack or disclose or patch in a later time, actually the player implicitly chooses to withhold this vulnerability at the current moment. And furthermore, we model this game as a stochastic game because player states actually change due to previous action. For example, if two players, player 1 and player 2, and player 1 chooses to disclose this, actually player 1 knows this vulnerability, but player 2 hasn't known about this vulnerability. So player 1 can choose to either to attack, patch, or withhold, whereas player 2 can only choose to no op. If player 1 decides to withhold, in the second round, there is a possibility that player 2 will find this vulnerability. And we have a parameter to demonstrate the probability that the player discover this vulnerability by himself at a particular time. Also, if player 1 chooses to attack, then there is a possibility that still the other player independently find this vulnerability, but also there is another possibility that the adversary actually discovered or detected the attack coming from the first player, which is player 1. So in this case, there are two different kind of possibilities, and we combine them together, and we use Q to demonstrate probability that the other player discovers or detects this attack. And finally, if player 1 chooses to patch, then now usually the way that a player patches is to disclose this vulnerability to the software vendor, and the software vendor is gonna disclose this vulnerability with the patch. So in this case, both players will know about this vulnerability, so that actually both players will be able to patch. So in this case, the state of the players will change from D, not D, to both knowing this vulnerability. On the other hand, we just mentioned that the shred model doesn't think about or doesn't assume that players know about the other player's state, and we want to overcome this limitation by abstracting this game as an incomplete information game. So again, let's think about we have a game, and let's think about at the specific state actually both players has known this vulnerability. However, from player 1's perspective, player 1 doesn't know whether or not the player 2 has known this vulnerability. So player 1 has his belief, has to guess how likely that the other player has known about this vulnerability. In conclusion, we now have this model as a partial observation stochastic game. And the next is that we are going to calculate the Nash equilibrium. However, computing the Nash equilibrium for a partial observation stochastic game is known to be intractable. And this is because of the infinite recursive belief over there. So the question is, how can we still come up with something that is computable so that we can still get our strategy or compute our decisions over there? So we found that in our model, actually players infer the other player's state by those parameters, and we assume that those parameters are accessible. For example, if I am one player, then I can observe the previous game and that the other player plays, and I can estimate their skill level in the previous zero-day vulnerabilities, so that I can decide how likely for a particular vulnerability that the other player will be able to find this independently. But we assume that there's no deception over there. And actually this comes to a very interesting topic that we do have a lot of speakers that mentioned during our workshop, which is perfect. Okay, so in this way, we convert the partial observation stochastic game to stochastic game, and now we can approximate Nash equilibrium using dynamic programming. All right, now we have the model, we have the algorithm, and we want to think about how to apply this model and the algorithm to some interesting cases. For example, the Cyber Grand Challenge. As I mentioned, this is a big game, and in the final of the game, we have 7 teams, and in this game, there are 100 vulnerabilities, and each team is playing 95 rounds, and each team is going to discover vulnerabilities or attack and patch the other machines if the team has discovered this vulnerability. For example, if I am the orange team, and if I found a bug over there, that I can attack the other team and I will gain offense score. Also, I can patch myself, but the patch itself may actually hurt the performance of my challenge, of my binary that are running over there. So I can defend, I can win some defense score, but also I may hurt my performance score because of this not very robust patch over there. So the total score is calculated by combining these 3 different aspects together. And we found that Shellfish, the 3rd position team, actually could have won with the 2nd place if they had applied our model for decision making. And this is very appealing to us because that means, a difference of $250K, and that means a lot to us for university people. That is a decent amount of money, and that sounds great. But you may want to ask, this is just a game. Even though, yes, you win some more dollars, you have a better position, the game is over, right? So what? Like this model, what can we get from this model? What is the impact of this model besides applying it to a concrete game? And this comes to the other way that we want to think about, game theory and the contribution of game theory to a specific or practical security scenarios, or the field of cybersecurity. Especially for me, it's software security. So right now we have proposed a way to make decisions based on the techniques that we already have over there, where those techniques are the actual values of those parameters, and we use that to find our strategy. However, on the other hand, the other thing that we want to think about is that, how can those decisions actually guide us to develop techniques? Because we create so many techniques now, and we actually don't know what techniques are actually beneficial to us when we make a decision. And this is something that I think it's very interesting, or it's very actually useful to me when I think about how game theory combine or complement the techniques development over there. For example, still from this cyber warfare game model, previous model, due to those limitations, they have conclusions that at least one player wants to attack. And also, the attacking players should always attack right away if the player has decided to attack. However, we found that if players can retaliate, then it is possible that neither players wants to attack. And this is very interesting. That means that we are somehow building the mutual deterrence in cyberspace, which is the maintenance of peace between opposing sides by each having retaliation capacity to deter the other from initiating conflict. Then the question is how to have this retaliation capacity. And we create this technique, and we call this new types of attack the ricochet attack. Especially, we create ricochet attack for control flow hijacking exploits. And a control flow hijacking exploit is a very serious types of attack that someone can compromise the machine to do arbitrary execution based on the machine. And more specifically, we want to think about if someone has the vulnerable program, which doesn't have to be having the source code. Binary code is good enough. And also, if someone has already captured the exploit, and now this guy has his own shellcode, has his own payload, or the malicious, or like the intentional behavior that wants to put into the new exploit, then can we automatically generate a new exploit that will trigger the original vulnerability, the vulnerability that we have received from a zero-day attack, and also execute the replacement shellcode, which is something that we want to fulfill if the vulnerability is triggered. And based on that, we create a tool, we call it shell swap, and this is a high-level infrastructure of shell swap. At the beginning, we replay the exploit, and we update the shellcode over there, and if it fails, we will have two ways to fix the failure. We call it layout remediation and path knitting. Okay, so exploit replay. So the idea for exploit replay is to use concurrent execution, which is a combination of concrete execution and symbolic execution. So due to the limit of the time, I won't go to the details of concurrent execution, but what I can tell you is that based on concurrent execution and based on the shellcode that we want to replace, we will have two different types of constraint over there that we want to solve. So we will have the shellcode constraint, which guarantees that after the vulnerability is triggered, it will execute the shellcode that we want to execute over there. And also, we will have path constraints, which will guarantee that the new input will go to the exact path of the original exploit goes to. And this guarantees the success of triggering the vulnerability and also the success of executing the replacement shellcode. Then we solve this constraint. However, it's possible that there's no solution. You just put it over there, there's a conflict over there. Then how are we gonna resolve this conflict over there? And we have layout remediation and path knitting. In terms of evaluation, we evaluate this tool on 100 testing cases based on Cyber Grand Challenge binaries, and we found that out of 100 testing cases, our tool shell swap was able to generate new exploit for 85 of those testing cases. And for those 85 new exploits, more than 70% of exploits are actually generated within 3 minutes. And this is very interesting. So that means that if you have this tool and you already have your payload over there, you don't need to do nothing but wait. Let's run the tool over there, grab a cup of coffee, and by the time you come back, your exploit is there waiting for you. And also, using the game theory model and the ricochet attack, we demonstrate that automatic exploit reuse is possible, and also mutual deterrence is possible in cyberspace, both from both technical and also strategic perspectives. And more importantly, we want to show that in the research of cybersecurity, we want to set up a methodology that between techniques and decision making. So based on the current techniques, we will always have our current decision. And also, based on the decisions that we compute over there, we want to think about how to boost our technique, which will help us not only by enforcing the strategy, but also to, enrich to or like open the more different kind of actions, provided these possibilities that, when we think about our decision, we can have new ideas about what we could do and what we can improve in the future. All right, thank you everyone. Now I'm happy to take any questions.